Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week, the former Director General of the BBC, Lord Tony Hall, has warned against proposals to switch off Freeview by 2034, a move the BBC has floated as part of the shift towards a digital-only future. Tony Hall argues this could leave around 8 million people, many of them elderly, low-income or in rural areas, without access to live television, as they may be unable or unwilling to transition to internet-based services. Meanwhile, attention is turning to the BBC's World Service, with the government spending review due on Wednesday. The World Service, as you know, is funded in part by the Foreign Office, and reports suggest it's facing a flat cash settlement. Given inflation, this amounts to a real terms cut. A cross-party group of MPs has warned that any reduction in the World Service funding risks weakening the UK's global soft power, especially at a time when countries like Russia and China are ramping up their international media influence. So this week I'm speaking to Iain Dale, LBC presenter, prolific broadcaster, author and political commentator, who has just published a short biography of Margaret Thatcher, a leader who, whatever your politics, projected Britain's global influence with striking soft power. His new book aims to challenge some of the myths around her legacy. I'm not entirely persuaded, but it's a very good read. We're going to talk about Mrs. Thatcher's often combative relationship with the BBC, the long shadow she casts over public service broadcasting, and what's at stake today as the BBC and the entire public media model faces mounting political and market pressures. Iain Dale, thank you for joining us on the podcast. Why do we need another biography of Mrs. Thatcher? Is it all the fault of your personal trainer?
Well, that is a very good question, because I don't know how many there are, but I've got them all, and I imagine there's probably 30 or 40, most of which are actually really good. But of course, nobody can compete with the brilliant Charles Moore trilogy. I think there's about 3,000 pages. So you think, well, why would I try? And I haven't. I mean, there's no point in trying to compete with that. The point of this series on Prime Ministers, which Swift Press are publishing, is to introduce them to a new generation, particularly the more recent ones. So you've got Alan Johnson, who has written about Harold Wilson. I think Steve Richards is doing Tony Blair. And they said, would I like to do Margaret Thatcher? And I was sort of umming and ahhing about it, because I thought, how can you distill Margaret Thatcher's life into, well, they said 30,000 words. And I said, well, that's a pamphlet, not a book. So I managed to get them to let me do 45,000. But I soon discovered that it was much more difficult to write a short book than a long one. And the reason I've done it in this way is because I broke my hip a couple of years ago, and I got a personal trainer, which I know sounds really pretentious, but I was advised to do it. And I still go to him. And he was 25. And when he found out what I did for a living, he said, well, Margaret Thatcher, I've heard of her, but what did she do? He didn't even know that she'd been Prime Minister. And he's an intelligent guy. He's not sort of an oik. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write this for him. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to do two things. Not cover every aspect of her life, because you can't in that word length, but try to introduce her to people who either weren't alive when she was Prime Minister or were adults but maybe hadn't voted. You have to be 56 years old now to have voted for Margaret Thatcher.
I know, it's quite extraordinary. It's like me at 25 thinking, do I want to know about Baldwin and Ramsay MacDonald?
Exactly.
And the question is, what are they going to do with me? And of course, Mrs. Thatcher has a lot to do with us now and that. But what I thought extremely valuable about the book was, particularly those who lived through it, was to get your perspective on the myths that had accrued. Yeah. I'm vaguely aware of them. And there are a lot of myths. But the end chapter of the book actually is a list from you, I think about 10 myths that you want to explode, relating to her attitude to South Africa, for example, and other things. Why are people misinterpreting Mrs. Thatcher in this way? And I think they do it from the left and the right. Why?
Yes, I thought it was really interesting. The other day, people were saying, well, of course, Nigel Farage is the ultimate Thatcherite. And I was thinking, are you kidding? Because he would probably regard himself as that. But It's debatable as to whether she would have supported Brexit. I personally don't think she would. I think she would have voted Remain. She was actually much more pro-European than she ever gave the impression. She was a Eurosceptic, but then again, you've got quite a lot of pro-Europeans who would also describe themselves as Eurosceptics. You think back to the famous Bruce speech in 1988, when she said, we haven't rolled back the frontiers of state in this country to see them reimposed at a European level. Now, you take that sentence out of that speech, and you think, oh, she must have wanted to leave the EU or been ultra-Eurosceptic. Well, you read the rest of the speech, and it's really pro-European. So I think a lot of people have taken a rather lazy attitude to her views on Europe.
I was thinking also with Nigel Farage, the attitude on sound money, as she would have put it, is extraordinary. I mean,
oh well, exactly. I mean, this whole idea. I mean, he seems to think that adopting a left-wing economic policy with a socially conservative sort of social policy, that's the way to win. Well, that's not what she did at all.
And of course, what she didn't have to cope with is social media, and what she didn't have to cope with was 10-second sound bites, which make a suggestion that basically there's a conspiracy against your point of view, and if only the public knew the reality, they'd support us, or Nigel Thatcher, or whatever. She was, but on the other hand, I remember her when I had the good fortune to be an editor of current affairs programmes almost throughout her prime ministership, and she said famously about one that we did, I hate these interviews, I hate them, I hate them, I hate them. And yet she came back time and again and did them, and wanted them to be longer and longer, because she really wanted the argument to be had and get into the detail. Yeah. And you can't imagine a contemporary political figure who really enjoys that cut and thrust of, well, I disagree with you, but let's hear and let's go and let's get into this.
Well, you see, that's another one of the myths, that she didn't like an argument. She was a dictator, that she ruled her cabinet with an iron fist. She loved to have an argument. And I mean, this anecdote is not new, but John Major had a massive row with her when he was a junior minister. And he thought he'd blown his whole career. And he said Dennis Thatcher was present as well. And he said, no, she'll have loved it. And of course, the next reshuffle, he was promoted to the cabinet. And there were lots of examples of that. And I think, you see, this is where she and Kemi Badenoch have quite a lot in common. And if you read the chapter on when she was leader of the opposition, there's so many parallels to today. But the one parallel you can't draw, and this is where Kemi Badenoch has a much more difficult job, is that she didn't have to cope with the 24/7 media. And I mean, Kemi Badenoch hates the media. I mean, literally the same as you described Margaret Thatcher's view. She doesn't like doing interviews, but she knows she has to. And Margaret Thatcher was not good on the media in her first few years in power. And she had all of the same criticisms that Kemi Badenoch is getting now. But whether Kemi Badenoch survives like Margaret Thatcher was able to, well, we will soon see.
But I think one of the most remarkable things about Thatcher was that she hated it, but she was prepared to listen to professionals. Because when I was a young producer, I met a man called Gordon Rees, and later made him Sir Gordon Rees, and it was his PR man, if you like, or dealing with the press. And we'd say to him, she was coming on Panorama, we'd like to cover this area, this area, this area, and he would say, let me see the set. I don't want flowers behind her. And he was concerned with impressions. And then he was the man who famously got her to lower her voice, also have her hair done, whatever. And she listened. Yeah. This woman who apparently, was so firm in her views would say, OK, I've got to do this. We're the best people. What's the advice? I will do it. Grit my teeth. Oh, gosh, I can't stand it. But here we go. It's got to be done. And then she get engaged. But I think with the final thing I just want to say about it, which really came across to me, was that in 1975, I think, when she won the leadership of the party, she was in such a minority, both in terms of her views, and I think she was the only woman, or the two women in shadow cabinet, and the condescension of the Conservatives likeable people like Carrington, even so, and whatever, was that she was obviously wasn't going to last. Yeah. Oh, gosh, what are we going to do? And to fight year after year up to that election, to hold on, to keep going, and then to fight in those first 2 years, whatever you think, was extraordinary, which makes it all the more tragic, the end of it all, when she didn't get out, when her husband suggested early on, she did isolate herself. She was surrounded by some very capable and some very dubious people. And in the end, she insulted too many of her cabinet ministers, didn't she, who just couldn't take it anymore?
Well, yes, all of what you've just said is true. I think there was more to it than that. I think she actually suffered because she did take the advice of the whips, and particularly the chief whip, and particularly...
Who she appointed, though, as you make clear in the book.
Well, exactly. I mean, Tim Renton, who I published his autobiography about 20 years ago, and he was the first chief whip ever to have written a book. I mean, Simon Hart keeps claiming he is, but he isn't. And he told me that he didn't even vote for her in the first round of voting in the 1990 leadership election. And I was astonished by this. And I said to him, but you were...
You call it betrayal, actually, in the book.
It was a betrayal. And I mean, she called the whole episode treachery with a smile on its face, which is an exaggeration. There was no plot. There was no coordinated plot to get rid of her, I don't think. Had she known that Tim Renton had done that, who, of course, was a great ally of Sir Geoffrey Howe, I mean, she would have had to have sacked him. And so her appointments, not just with him, but many of her other appointments to her cabinet, they were not people, they weren't one of us. And all prime ministers have to appoint people who are not their natural soulmate. So you've got Kemi Badenoch, who's got Robert Jenrick in a prominent position. You have to do that. But you've got to have a majority support in your own cabinet. And even at the end, she kept appointing people like William Aldergrave. Nice guy, competent guy, but utterly dripping wet. And there were many other examples like that. And a lot of her other allies, like Cecil Parkinson and Norman Tebbit, they fell by the wayside for various different reasons. And she didn't replace them with a Praetorian Guard who would really look after her interests while she was busy running the country.
The man was insulting Geoffrey Howe to the point at which it's a miracle he stayed as long as he did.
You're right. I mean, she did treat him badly. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I remember on the day he resigned, I was in the Commons and walking down the corridor, and there was Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe sort of coming towards me, chatting away, laughing away, as if they were best friends on the day he resigned.
Yes, something some of us will never quite understand about that political friendships, perhaps. But I want to pick up as a theme, if I may, Mrs. Thatcher and broadcasting and her long-lasting impact, if you like, on attitudes. I was seeing Sir Paul Marshall, who is now probably a supporter of reform, I think we can say, but the proprietor of GB News, The Spectator and Unheard.
Well, he used to be a Liberal Democrat.
Did, but he's moved a long, long way. He called for the BBC to be broken up and its fact-checking service shut down. The BBC squats, he said, like a giant toad in the middle of the UK media landscape. It is a propaganda arm of the state. I don't particularly want to spend a lot of time on that analysis. What intrigues me, though, is lots of people on the right still believe that's broadly the case. And Mrs. Thatcher certainly was deeply suspicious and indeed got a Director General fired because she was suspicious of the BBC. That was Alistair Milne. Why do you think there is this consistent attitude of suspicion about the BBC? Is it just that it's commercially blocking the way to advancement for people, or is it more than that?
I think there's always been a suspicion of people on the right, but then again, people on the left laugh at this because they say, well, we're suspicious of it too. I think it's in large part to the fact that the BBC, either at executive level or producer level or presenter level, has appeared to appoint people on the liberal left. Now, I don't say sort of Labour Party supporters necessarily. I just mean people whose attitude to life is of a more liberal nature. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think the BBC has consistently failed to recognise that there is another point of view, and that point of view exists predominantly outside London. You look, for example, I was listening to your interview with Nick Ferrari last night, actually, and he made a point that I haven't heard him make before, that his breakfast programme on LBC inside London loses out to the Today programme by a factor of, well, goodness knows what, but outside London, in many areas of the country, he gets more listeners than the Today programme does. Now, why is that? It is because the audience in London is very different to that outside London. And the BBC has always been very London-centric. Even since they moved a lot of their operations to Salford, it's still a London-centric organisation. And that's inevitable. London is the capital city. I make no complaint about that. And I think at times they have made attempts to correct this sort of balance. I think Brexit was a real watershed for the BBC in many ways. And I mean, I think the BBC actually, I don't agree with Nick Ferrari on this. I think the BBC did a really good job of covering the referendum campaign and was actually very balanced on it. But after that, with the sort of 4 or 5 years of Brexit shenanigans, I mean, I remember once being invited to go on a Newsnight panel to talk about some development in the Brexit deal. And I said, well, who else is going to be on? And they said, Alistair Campbell, Matthew Parris, and Faiza Shaheen. Faiza Shaheen was a Labour candidate at the time and very pro-EU. So they expected me to go on with three Remainers, even though the Brexit side had won the actual debate. And I said, if you think that that is fair broadcasting, I'm a Dutchman. And I said, I'm not going on with three. I said, I'll go on with two, but even that I think is wrong. So my proudest moment in my life was getting Alistair Campbell ditched from Newsnight.
That's a major achievement. Absolutely. But I mean, I would say that on the whole, they tried to keep it balanced. And I think one of the problems post-Brexit is that since there was no clear way forward then on which all those who were in favour of Brexit agreed for, it was a sort of, well, we've left, what now? And that was a lot of the problem. And I think the problem you alluded to earlier is that I think consistently Radio 4, for example, is far more listened to in London and the South East than elsewhere. And that has gone on for, well, at least maybe longer than this, 20 or 30 years. So I think there is that. Now, what the causes of that are, I'm not sure. But when I go back to Mrs. Thatcher, she... when I sort of collided with her sometimes Edge of Panorama before that, her husband was certainly whispering in the ear. It actually did say, they're all pinkers and traitors after one interview we did have a fixed view about the BBC. She was determined to bring it, as she said, under control, and eventually managed to get people in that she thought would control it. She then turned her attention to ITV, this is way back 30 years now, and changed the process by which ITV companies could get renew their franchises by putting up to the highest bidder with a small qualification. Because she thought it was overmanned, which it was, but also she was determined to bust that. But she had this faith in the market that it would provide. And I remember one long discussion with her after, I think probably about 1988, after an interview, and she was talking about the new world where the BBC wouldn't be relevant, ITV wouldn't be relevant because we had satellite channels and all of that sort of stuff. And then we said to Mrs. Thatcher, but Mrs. Thatcher, therefore that means propaganda coming in from Russia. It also means pornography. No, we won't allow that. But she didn't explain. So it was strange that in broadcasting, she didn't think things through, it seemed to me, the way she did in a number of other areas. Perhaps she didn't think it worthwhile or whatever. But it was if, oh, well, no, it'll sort the market. We'll sort it out. What do you think now in broadcasting is the role, if there is a role, for a public service broadcaster, which is to an extent dealing with market failure?
Well, I think it is a massive challenge for a state broadcaster now. In fact, not just a state broadcaster, it's a massive challenge for any linear broadcaster to remain relevant because there is so much competition, not just in the television world, but outside in the social media world. And I mean, Roger, you and I are of a certain age where, although we've adapted to social media, we don't really understand it from a youth point of view. And I remember 10, 12 years ago, going to speak to media studies students at Kingston University, and I asked them to put their hands up if they bought a daily newspaper. Out of 30, one did. And I suspect nowadays that one wouldn't either. So the newspaper world is changing, and so is the broadcasting world, where most people under the age of 25 do not watch television at all. And if they do, it'll be on their phone. They won't sit down of an evening like you and I probably still do and watch a series in the traditional way. And I don't think any television company, whether it's the BBC, ITV or anyone else, has really come to terms with this yet. And I suspect in 10 or 15 years, if a BBC programme has an audience of 4 million now, it'll have an audience of maybe 1 million in 10 years' time. Well, how do you keep relevant as a broadcaster in that situation? Because you have to adapt. They seem to be trying to adapt with no strategy. They think, oh, we've got to go after the youth. Well, that's not working very well, is it? Whether it's in radio or television.
Well, I think the classic problem the BBC caught with is this. It says if everybody pays the licence fee, we have to give something to everybody. At the same time, it has to say, well, actually, if the market is providing something, we've got to provide saying the market doesn't.
Exactly.
But how much money can we provide on that if we've also got to satisfy everybody? If you've got a very significant income, it's not a big problem. When you cut and cut and cut, and you've tried to do everything as you were doing it, you get a thinner offering to the general public and a thinner problem offering, if you like, to those interested in public service. In the end, you can't do that, and much longer, in my view.
I think there was a watershed moment And that was when Ofcom decided in favour of Boom Radio over the BBC, because the BBC has a track record of when they see the commercial sector doing something really well, they think they have to compete. Well, they don't have to compete. They should be doing what they do well and providing the things that the private sector cannot do, like news and current affairs. And you look at the diminution of BBC News and Current Affairs over the last, well, not just 10 years, probably 20 or 30 years. And you look at the number of foreign bureau that they now have. I mean, when do you hear anything apart from America, the Middle East, and the odd report from Russia?
Yeah, but to defend the BBC, they would say a large part of this is the cuts in the World Service funding, which is going on. And also, it's this licence fee problem, which is if everybody pays it, everybody has to get something, which means that you have to cut in those areas which are, I think you and I would agree, should not be cut in order to protect other areas. That's why I think, we need this fundamental debate about, do we need public service broadcasting anymore? If we do, who delivers it? How does it get delivered? And then how do you pay for it? We can't postpone this anymore.
Well, we've been saying that for 20 years, and it keeps being postponed because the BBC will continue to try to cover everything. And if you try and cover everything, inevitably, in many areas, you do it badly. We don't need huge amounts of money spent on BBC Sport because the private sector covers sport in a much better way than the BBC does nowadays. I mean, who thinks that the BBC coverage of football is in any way competitive with Sky? It just is not. So they could just pull out of that.
Well, it can't be because they can't cover all the live matches that Sky have got, so Sky have got the field to themselves.
No, but I'm talking about just the programmes, the way they present the programmes, the people that they're using. It's very old-fashioned. You look at entertainment programmes, again, a lot of BBC One still tries to compete with private sector broadcasters. Well, why? Just to chase audience. That's what it is. I think the remit.
Well, because it feels it scares it will lose once it loses and it is losing inevitably the support of the public. It loses support for the licence fee. Therefore, it is where's the income coming from? But what it would bring back to Margaret Thatcher, and I'm really fascinated by this, is I wonder what she would do, because she had, you know better than I do, so correct me. She has all these free market instincts. But she also has a clear view of the role of the state and institutions. She's a scientist. She is, paradoxically, as you point out, one of the first to realise the importance of climate change, which makes it fascinating to see how many climate change almost deniers call themselves her followers. So she's a scientist who clearly involves that. She clearly appreciates her education. I don't know what to do about grammar schools and so on. But would she be happy to sit back and say, let the market rule, when you can see that we have a problem with maths, we have a problem with science, we have a problem in so many areas where we need to also desperately inform our children about history, a proper understanding for a start of the history of anti-Semitism and so on as a background to what's going on. Do you think she would sit back and just say, well, the market can deliver all of that stuff?
Well, to an extent, the market is delivering some of that stuff. You look at, Channel 5, for example, which, it's not a state broadcaster. It was set up by the state, but it's not a state broadcaster. Their history schedules are really impressive compared to other broadcasters. And they've decided that they're going to make that one of their niches. And good on them, I say. And I think that's where, again, the BBC has just kind of, well, not given up on history, but you certainly don't get the kind of history programs, and if you do, they tend to be dramas that you would have got 10 or 20 years ago.
But you have on the BBC News website, for example, a tremendous amount of...
Oh, don't get me started on that.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to. But in terms of the Gaza and so on, there's a tremendous amount available on BBC websites. But I'm trying to focus a little bit on the educational level of whether we as a society should say, okay, in terms of adults, let's say the market works. But what is our role in terms of educating young people and making sure that they have not just access to, but actually learn about things like the history of the Soviet Union, and Russian imperialism for a start, or other things like that? Do we simply say it's not a broadcaster's job?
Well, I think that is part of the state broadcaster's job, and I think she would have regarded that as part of the state broadcaster's job. And when the BBC really decides to go for it, they do it very well. You look at some of the documentaries that have been made recently by the likes of Laura Kuenssberg on recent political events, absolutely brilliant and not expensive to make either. And this is where, again, in this area, I mean, going back to the what we were talking about on politics, and I know you've been a critic of this, the decision to get rid of hard talk, the decision to get rid of straight talk with Andrew Neil, two of the cheapest programs that you could possibly make. I mean, what can be expensive about having an interviewer and a guest in a studio? And in Andrew Neil's case, it was a completely black studio, so no design cost or anything. And you think, well, either Andrew Neil was on like £1 million a program, and that's why they had to can it, or what's the logic of that? And that is where public service broadcasting should come into its own. And I totally agree with you on the educational side. And I don't think the private sector has stepped up to the plate in the way that it ought to have done in this. But I don't think do you know the one thing which I think really affected her view of the private sector in broadcasting is when TVAM lost their franchise. And she couldn't believe that this had happened, and then found it very difficult to accept that it was her policy that made this happen.
She wrote a letter, a personal letter to Bruce Gingell, saying, effectively, as I understand it, sorry, Bruce, this wasn't supposed to happen to you.
No, absolutely.
You weren't supposed to lose. Yeah.
And I think that really shook her. I remember as a young lobbyist covering the broadcasting bill, which David Mellor was taking through Parliament, and it wasn't as if they weren't warned that unfortunate things could follow from it. I mean, the decline of all the... I mean, if you're under the age of 40 or 50, you probably don't even remember the likes of Anglia Television or all of the different ITV brands.
Well, you come from that area. You were born and brought up. And presumably you now think there's no real television station which caters to the interests directly and almost exclusively of people in East Anglia.
No, there isn't. And there is no... Whether it's in television or radio, the local angle has almost gone. Now, that is due to government policy in many ways and regulation. Now, I think there's actually a real opportunity for local media organisations to step into the breach there. Community radio. If I had a lot of money, I would be investing in community radio all over the country now, because they are now the local radio stations. But if the BBC continues in its quest to dominate everything media-wise, they will snuff that out at birth. And they've done it in so often. I remember presenting programmes on a station, I don't know if you remember this, called One Word back in about 2003. And then the BBC decided that looked very successful. So they then created BBC Radio 7, which morphed into Radio 4 Extra. And within 3 months, One Word was gone. They've done that on magazines. When they started Match of the Day magazine, that snuffed out various football magazines. And that's why I was so glad when the decision on Boom Radio was made by Ofcom, because it was a warning to them not to go there.
I think BBC's always had imperialist tendencies, but equally they've got the obligation to provide for every licence fee payer. But finally, just in our last few minutes, I want to talk about what do you think has gone, well, I'm going to make a judgment here, gone wrong with GB News and Talk TV and so on, because I've appeared on GB News quite a lot trying to make the argument for public service broadcasting and sometimes defend the BBC. And this is so far away from what you do, and it's so far away from what Andrew Neil intended. It basically is an organisation which tells there's a simple answer here, you're being lied to, you should be angry. And when you go on that and try and present an alternative view, which, they need to ask you because of Ofcom, you get a prejudiced intro. You then you're harangued a bit and you try and get your word in edgeways. And then afterwards they say, well, that was Rick, as he would say that, wouldn't he? Now, I'm not making any special pleading. I do it because I think I ought to do it. But the point I'm making is it's a long way from what people like Andrew and you would have hoped to do, which is basically, as I understand it, not particularly to argue about facts, but certainly to argue about policy, which you think is mistaken, and provide alternative viewpoints, interpretations, and so on, predominantly from a right-wing perspective, which is, in your view, needed. Now, that hasn't happened, in my view, is not there. It's happened on radio. It happens with Nick Ferrari and others. It's not happening in GB News. It's not happening on Talk TV, on the whole, in my view.
Well, let me shock you and tell you that I very rarely ever watch GB News, partly for the reasons that you've just expressed. And in a way, you think, look, I'm self-confessed centre-right, possibly nowadays more centre than right, some people might say. I keep being accused of being a closet Liberal Democrat. I'm thinking, well, if I was, I would tell people, but I'm not. That channel should appeal to me. But it doesn't, because I don't like silo TV or silo radio, by which I mean where you just watch something because you know you'll agree with it. I mean, how interesting is that? I want to watch things that challenge my thoughts, that think, well, am I right on this? And I sometimes when presenting my radio show, I start off an hour on a subject maybe that I'm not an expert on. I start off the hour with a particular view, which I express, and then challenge my listeners to challenge me. They do, and by the end of the hour, it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes I have actually thought, oh, maybe I was wrong on that, and I've changed my mind. That's interesting broadcasting, I think. It's not interesting just to have a group of people that generally agree with each other, or have a group of people plus the token lefty who is on there as a sacrificial lamb. I don't find that entertaining broadcasting. I don't think it should be banned. I think it should be allowed to happen. But, I mean, credit to them. They have built up an audience. I don't think they should even have ever called themselves GB News, because it's not a news channel, it's an opinion channel, and there's nothing to be ashamed of by being an opinionated channel, but they could be honest about it.
Well, I think people who read your book on Thatcher will rethink their positions as well on a number. So it's certainly challenging, and a lot of people will be disturbed to find they agree with most of what you said.
Well, I was really gratified that Mary Beard, who I do know, but I mean, let's put it this way, she's not on the right. She reviewed it in the Observer at the weekend, and she completely understood what I was trying to do. And she said it did challenge some of her initial preconceptions or prejudices, maybe, and she did learn something new from it. So I thought, well, my job here is done.
Mm. Although she still doesn't think Mrs. Thatcher was a feminist, but
no, but I mean, you're not going to convince people totally out of their original views, are you?
No, Iain Dale, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Iain Dale, LBC presenter, whose book Margaret Thatcher is available now. It is a cracking read, though you may disagree with some of his conclusions. Now, if you're enjoying our journalism, please consider supporting us. It's less than the price of a cup of coffee each month. You can make a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page, or join us on Patreon at patreon.com/BeebWatch for just £1.99 a month. Patreon supporters get exclusive access to my weekly blog, which is sometimes worth reading. It's where I share my personal take on that week's interview. You'll find links to both the crowdfunding page and Patreon in the description. And that's it for this week. And as you probably know, this podcast was presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.